the economic, the geopolitical power of the US today derives largely from its large corporations as much as the US Army or the US government. Tell me, how much of a parallel do you see between the British incorporated empire and the US of today?
I don't anticipate a future where the US government absorbs and takes over the functions of an Amazon or Google in the way that, in a sense, took over the functions of the East India Company in 1858.
The great game between Britain and Russia at the time playing out in Central Asia was seen as a two-player game, but as I clearly argue even in my book, I think to your point that the great tech game, this competition and this dynamic is global. At this moment of time, it seems that the US and China are the two major players, but much like Spain, Portugal were replaced by England and Netherlands, and then eventually other countries like France in the whole colonial great game. Similarly, I think in the great tech game, other players will emerge.
I think India is a wonderful example of how, the story today about technology is not just about the United States and China.
Welcome. I'm excited to be on this next episode of the Great Tech Game podcast with Professor Philip Stern, who teaches history at Duke University, but is also the author of a book that has just come out, Empire Incorporated, a little while ago, that talks about the corporations that built British colonialism. But Professor Stern has written many other books and articles about the phenomenon of the empire, phenomenon of these corporations that have existed for the last several centuries and how they've shaped our world. And for those of you who've read my book, The Great Tech Game, will also be familiar with the fact that there was a big era where these corporations were engaged in this tug of war that I call between them and the state, or the empires that existed, or the crown that existed in the case of Britain, and how that tug of war played out back in the day possibly has lessons for how some similar tugs of wars that are going on today between the private sector and the nation states that exist today that we have on hand. So I'm super excited to have you on our podcast today. Welcome, Philip.
Oh, thank you. I'm really excited to be here and grateful to be here. As I was telling you before, these are precisely the sorts of themes I was hoping my book would speak to. So I've been looking forward to this conversation for.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, as I was saying, I think that the theme of empires and studying them more deeply, and the colonial corporations in particular that existed, the era that you cover, I think is an important one that has great relevance for today, not just from a historian standpoint, I think as we were discussing, but really from a geopolitical standpoint, from a policy standpoint, I think even from the perspective of nation states that today are grappling again with very large global corporations that are often assuming many functions beyond the commercial ones that they might have started with. And so it's always fun to go back into history and see how things had panned out, and whether, if any, there are lessons for today. So let's start with the theme of venture colonialism that you cover in your book. I think that, as someone who's been in the venture capital world for the last decade or so, as I was researching for my own book, The Great Tech Game, and I came across these terms, the adventure capitalists of the day, and those early ships were going out to explore new lands. And I looked at the structures in which the queen or the kings that were sometimes shareholders in these exploratory ships would structure their relationships with the ones who actually went out there, seem to have lots of parallels, if I may say, with the way the venture capital industry today is structured. And so that had, I remember, really piqued my curiosity. And then, of course, you talk about this as venture colonialism, corporate colonialism, and various other such concepts. So why don't you actually start off and tell us a little bit about venture colonialism as the way you've defined it in your book, Empire Incorporated?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great place to start, and I'm glad you noticed that concept. So there's maybe say there's two, maybe three ways that we might think about this idea. The first is I was trying to find a way, the book covers about 400 years of history in different proportions, and I was trying to find a way to think about how do we glue them together. So the first one thing I wanted to point out, I guess the term is meant to harken back to an earlier period in the 16th and 17th centuries where the book starts, what we might call today an investment or shareholding, or the kinds of words we've come to use in the modern world. One of the more common terms that people would have recognized in the 16th or 17th century would have been an adventure. A venture or an adventure. I'm adventuring my capital. I'm an adventurer in a company, that sort of thing. It was even in the names of the companies, the Merchant Adventurers of England, for example, or the Russia company, the Muscovy company, whose original first name was the Merchant Adventurers for the Discovery of Regions, Islands, Dominions, and Places Unknown, right? Something like that. I might have gotten those jumbled up, but we make a mistake if we think what they meant was something like a swashbuckling quest or something we might think of as an adventure today, a sort of Lord of the Rings sort of thing or something like that. What they meant was risk, right? They meant they were adventuring their capital and often their persons, their people, their very lives, that they were risking them for returns. And so I wanted to sort of think about the idea that a lot of this the foundations for the kind of colonial enterprise I'm talking about involve people uh, from a variety of aspects of civil society, both within the state and outside the state, undertaking these ventures through the double meaning through these kinds of companies, which we might think of as venturers or merchant venturers or merchant adventurers, that sort of thing. But I guess the other reason that the term appealed to me, I was thinking about it in this way, is that it also helps us to remember that the argument of the book, which is that for colonialism to happen, there had to be multiple and oftentimes contradictory impulses or motivations, right? So venture colonialism is not venture capitalism per se. I mean, you've been in venture capitalism. I haven't, so you can dispute me on this. But I think a lot of people would sort of think about venture capitalism in a passive way as just being about returns on financial returns on investment in some ways. But I know that actually that's not true. That there's venture capitalism with ethical and political and other kinds of motivations, environmental, these sorts of things. But I don't know that it sort of hits people immediately. So the venture colonialism meant to suggest that we need to remember that these companies, merchants, government officials, many, many others, sometimes philosophers, got involved in these projects for a range of reasons. Some were in it for what you might think of as commercial returns. Some were in it for religious purposes, or some were in it for political purposes. There's some companies in my book that seem to be driven by people's philosophical programs. I say in the book, there's a fair number of people who are invested because they like to gamble, or they're socially connected to other people who are investing, that sort of thing. So the idea
Correct.
is venture colonialism is neither venture capitalism nor colonial venture. It's something in between, and that makes you kind of think a little bit about not coming to the past with our present assumptions and then coming back to the present, having looked at the past, to think maybe our assumptions are wrong about how this works, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. No, and I think the thing I loved most as I read through your book was the 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 visuals that you draw of the time, right? That take you back into history to talk about how the guilds that existed prior, the merchant guilds that seem to have existed in places like Italy, let's say the trading states of Italy at the time, similar ones that existed in other trade-based hubs, right? You've talked about the Srenis and the Vaks around the world, and to me, like the way this concept is an evolution on that concept is what really found was what was very interesting to me. And so I want you to talk to me about what was different about these corporations, right, that start getting formed at the time that you're referring to in the 1600s, and some maybe even a few decades prior, and how they're different from the merchant guilds and that mercantilist era that often we are familiar with, and how fundamentally were these evolutions or different from the concepts that existed earlier that were part of the trading communities that were obviously still very much around and thriving before these corporations became prominent.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I'd say before I get into the differences is there's a long lineage, right? So these are like the ancestors or the foundations for the kind of joint stock corporations that emerge in what we might think of as the early modern, the 16th, 17th, 18th century period. And I wanted to make the point, I make it very briefly in the book. It was limited by how much people would be patient to read about it, but there's other books that are cited in the book for people to go think about these questions. That's also a global phenomenon, right? That you have these
Yeah,
kinds of merchant organizations around the world, right, including in India. Um, what sort of diverges or sort of changes with the advent of the joint stock corporation, I think, are two things. One is the joint stock part, the part where you have, and that's the one that you see more of a kind of lineage through these older uh, forms of commercial organization, where people will pool together their resources to have a single venture, like we were talking about before. So you asked what's different about, say, the guild. A guild, and there were companies that were like guilds that were also doing some of this overseas expansion in Europe at this time. Guilds are essentially umbrella organizations that regulate and organize and enforce common rights and privileges among independent traders. Guilds are, uh, will have multiple small, either individuals or partnerships that'll be admitted to the guild, or in the 16th and in the 17th century, a kind of overseas company like the Merchant Adventurers of England or the Levant Company, known as a regulated company, which is more guild-like in the sense that you'd have a bunch of individual traders, but they would be under the common charter, the common privileges, the common rights, the common ambassador of the companies. The company acts as a kind of protective mechanism, but it doesn't run the trade necessarily, if that makes sense. It's kind of governing over it. A joint stock
that's
is
right.
a radically different model. It's a model of government, I argue,
Yeah,
in the book, because it says we all submit to give in our investment to a common, what we would now call board of directors or CEO. At the time, just to give you a sense of my point, often called governors, right, using political language that we use today. So joint stock really changes the model of how this organization is. Very controversial at the time. It's not an easy transition. A lot of people thought this was deeply problematic for a variety of reasons, which maybe we can talk about if you want to. And then there's the corporation part. And the corporation part is where the real departure comes, because this is a kind of legal tradition or a legal technique or technology, you might think of it as. Interesting to think in terms of the great tech game about law as a form of technology as well.
yeah, yeah. I would
Yes.
almost call it an
Uh,
institutional innovation, right, of the time. Yeah,
It is absolutely an innovation. And what this does is this is a radical departure in a sense, because what it does is it creates protections in law, in European law and British law eventually, that allow for these corporations to sort of act. I mean, we think about that, we confront this problem still to today, or the quandary of like what it means to take a group of people and turn them into a kind of legal person, a single body. I mean, in the
yeah.
word corporation is the word corpus, body, right? And so
Body.
it's
That's
taking a
right.
group, sometimes a single person, and making them into a separate person for the purposes of the law.
That's right.
And that is a
Yeah,
that makes a whole lot of things possible, which if you want we can talk about, from the financial requirements, the debt required, for example, for colonial expansion, to the kinds of forms of government that are required to govern over people when they leave the jurisdiction of the British state or the British crown, and they're kind of trying to invent new ideas about how they might claim sovereignty from indigenous peoples, from the peoples that live there, and in their on their own terms. Yeah.
yeah. No, so a couple of things. So first on the joint stock piece, right? And I think these two are really the crux of your argument about these venture colonialism, that phenomenon, the joint stock piece and the corporations piece, right? Now, if you look at other countries around the world at that time, right? The Mughal Empire in India, for example. There's obviously other empires in the Middle East. There's obviously the city states in Italy, etc. Now, all of these places are, I would say, at that time, the front runners in trade, right? And the places in Western Europe where these companies really start getting built in the first place, at least to start with, are not necessarily in the center of the trading routes of the time, right? Is that, I mean, first of all, is that right? That they weren't at the center, as my understanding suggests, of the trading routes, and they're a little bit on the periphery. But these kind of innovations really help them get some kind of institutional advantage, I guess, that helps them come into that center.
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent that's right. I mean, I wouldn't want to underestimate the connections Europe had been trying to forge with Asian trade for centuries, right? Going back to the 12th, 13th centuries. What's happening in Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries is an interest in shifting that trade onto the sea, right, into maritime uh, pathways. And what's going on in the British case of the British Empire in the period I'm talking about, especially say with that company that becomes the Russia company, which is sort of one of the first of these enterprises, is that these other European enterprises, and I want to think about them as countries, just think about them as within various different jurisdictions, are all trying to catch up with the Spanish and Portuguese, who have, in a sense, in a variety of forms, uh, been leading this this attempt for Europe to get more of a share of these trade routes, both in the Indian Ocean as well as, of course, the Spanish Empire in the Americas. So I think you're right in when you say, when you point out how this is the Europe is in some sense on the periphery of this commercial enterprise when you think about it from that perspective. But it's not as if Europeans haven't been trying to get engaged in this for a while. This is, like I say, a new technology, a legal technology as a way of making those connections. And then within Europe, like as I was just saying, there's this competition for finding new trade routes. So a lot of the enterprises you see in the 16th century, and as someone who started, his career thinking about primarily about the East India Company, about British India and the British colonialism in India, is very interesting to think about it this way, which is even a lot of the early colonialism in North America. And we all know from, say, some of the more, common colloquial stories about Christopher Columbus and that sort of thing are about trying to find new routes to either South Asia or East Asia, and basically Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean commercial world, right? But eventually they become inseparable from efforts to, say, look for mines and new sorts of species and mineral resources for planting of people and colonization and agriculture and everything we sort of think of as more traditionally colonialism.
Yeah, and of course, I think the other thing that people often talk about, and when they talk about the competition between the Western European states like Spain, Portugal, and then later, England and Netherlands, is the improvements in navigational technology that these countries are trying to get around the African continent, right? But not enough emphasis, I think, is laid on these kinds of institutional innovations that I think allow that kind of risk capital to be aggregated for these adventurers in a way to embark out both towards eventually the North American region, but then also for them to successfully come around the Cape of Good Hope and reach the Indian Ocean. But I want to talk about
Well, yeah,
the societal implications of the. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'll give you one quick example. So I don't talk about it very much in this book, but I do in my previous book on the East India Company. Just a illustration that eventually, through the 17th century, the East India Company, for example, was established in 1600, and we shouldn't only talk about the East India Company. There's a whole lot of companies in that context, but um, eventually, for the large share of the 17th century, the East India Company didn't actually build or own its own ships, but leased them out, sort of subfinanced them, had them on contract through the captains, and the ship owners would essentially lent the ships to the East India Company. So one of the other points I make in this book is that when you think about companies, you can't think about them always as coherent single things. There are layers of
Yeah.
subsidiaries and finance instruments and political diffusion that makes all of this stuff possible. So it just sort of resonated with the point you were making about sort of who is, in a sense, innovating in this navigational technology. It's a lot of different parties connected to one another, if that makes sense. But I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. That's a great point. And I want to come to the structures and the subsidiaries and the various financial instruments that these companies end up using. But I wanted to just quickly ask you about the joint stock piece for 1 second. The joint stock piece, as you mentioned in your book, has several societal implications, right? I talk about in my book about, the printing press, for example, and how that has societal implications, right? In the sense of making religion no longer the domain of a few and knowledge no longer the domain of just a select few. So talk to us about the societal implications of the joint stock, because I think that's very interesting and possibly has some very interesting questions raised even for countries like India.
The questions have not gone away in certain respects. I mean, so one of the really interesting things that I guess I would say I had a vague understanding of when I started writing this book and was constantly surprised how much it kept coming back. It was, writing a book, as you know from writing a book, is part of it you go in and you hope you're proven right, but part of it is a process of discovering and moving around like running through a maze or something, and you discover so much, and sometimes you find out you were more right than you even realized, or that sort of thing. And one of the things I kept coming across was just how controversial and how much of a sort of social debate there was over the political and social implications of joint stock, not just the financial and economic ones, right? So I'll give you one major example. A lot of people argued for and against joint stock companies in the 17th and 18th centuries, and even into the 19th centuries, based on the idea that the joint stock model has a fundamentally and radically different model of the franchise than than most states do, right? Still to this day, but essentially states that were monarchies, right? So in monarchical Britain in the 17th century, people saw the joint stock as a kind of republican sort of enterprise because everyone bought stock could more or less vote. But in Britain and England in the 16th, 17th centuries, if you didn't have land, if you were a woman, certainly if you were a foreigner, you couldn't participate. You couldn't be a member of parliament. You couldn't even vote or participate in some of these in more of the direct political forms. Joint stock said, we'll take investments from the Dutch. We'll take investments from women, right? So a kind of conservative position on that, I'm not really sure, maybe it's not the right way of thinking about it, but someone thinking about tradition and the way tradition or organized would say, well, this is deeply problematic. On a more philosophical level, there was one early critic of joint stock companies in the early 17th century who pointed out that what joint stock does is, instead of creating what should be the normal order of things, which is a bond between the subject and the sovereign, it created bonds among subjects, right? Without the sovereign in that sense. And famously, the phrase he uses is, "This is like the Commonwealth being made private," which is a sentiment you can almost imagine translated would be something you'd hear in today in people thinking about the role between corporations and the state. So it has deep societal implications. By the 19th and 20th centuries, certainly the 19th century, as you start to have reform movements about, say, who can vote, how Britain itself should be organized, and what empire should look like. Joint stock, a lot of people proposed maybe this is a model. Maybe we should vote by how much land or investment in the polity we have, not just simply, by being citizens or subjects, right? And you can kind of see, obviously, how that could be also, radically problematic in certain ways and who it might leave out. It also has social implications for colonialism, one of my points in the book, because what does it mean when there's a different constituency making the decisions about colonial enterprise than the state itself, including people who aren't subjects or citizens. So that's one of the major issues. But then there's a lot of others that come with questions about Adam Smith, for example. I talk about this in the
Yes.
book. Was surprisingly, I think it'll surprise a lot of people, surprisingly hostile to the joint stock corporations, especially the colonial ones. But all of them, because to him, he argued that it led people to take unnecessary and radical risks with money because they were. He talked about it. They were risking other people's money. The social implications of that for financial crises and that sort of thing are phenomenal. And here is in a sense, the someone who's considered to be one of the sort of origins of modern liberalism, right? Who thinks that actually smaller partnerships are the way you are
Are the
responsible
way
with money. And a lot of
forward.
people, and one of the things I'll just say very quickly, one of the things I also wanted to point out in the book is a lot of people disagree with him. It's a debate, and so it's not as if everybody Wealth of Nations came out and then everybody said okay.
Yeah, yeah. Let's shift gears and talk about something. For me, like this historical context is extremely important, but then I also want to bring us to how this might have some relevance to today's world, right? And what lessons and insights we might draw with today's world. And there are two pieces I want to talk about here. The first is this tug of war between state and private corporation, right? You've spoken at length about it, both from a philosophical standpoint, economic standpoint, political governance standpoints, right? You talk about, I think at some point you say that it's very interesting to not just draw analogies with that time, but really look at the genealogy, I think, which is the point you're also starting to make now. But so I want to ask you, you mentioned Adam Smith, you mentioned Hobbes, and all of these guys at the time, as they're looking at this tug of war between what is considered the state at the time, the crown, and these private corporations, which often, again, are not necessarily all private, as you rightly said, sometimes have more of a dual nature. What is, in your view, if you were to step back and say, how has this relationship between the private sector corporations and state, right? State either being a nation state as it exists today, or the empire as it existed then. How has that relationship evolved according to you? Right? If you were to draw out a big picture for us, has much changed? Is that tug of war, what I call the tug of war, just going on and not much has changed? Or has it really evolved?
I think in the big picture, I'm going to stay on your side and say it's a tug of war that, or a kind of ebb and flow. I like the maritime metaphor even more, right? Given, I guess, what I'm looking at,
More appropriate.
which is,
That's right.
yeah, exactly.
I'm coming from more land-based war
Exactly right.
context. That's right.
Right. This is the
I can go.
constant tension in the histories of empires for millennia, land or sea. The big picture, certainly over the course of what I look at in the book, and I think it transfers into what happens after the book, which is the modern world, is that you have a kind of moment in time where it looks as if the state power, or that tug of war is on what, or that ebbing and flowing is going in one direction. After World War II, it seemed as
Yeah.
if you had a lot of people writing as if this was the final stage of history, right? That states had won. You see international organizations emerge like the United Nations, where nation states are the only bodies with membership in a certain sense. Not
Correct.
if you look really closely, but like
That matter.
right. But then and you saw an emergence of a kind of state-based organization to politics. But then by the time you look in the late 20th century, the early 21st century, and I'm stepping on your territory here. I'm not as much of an expert, but I do think about these things. Part of why I wrote the book. You start to see the emergence of or at least us being able to see a different kind of organization of international, of non-state forms of power, challenging, making the state reimagine how it organizes that. But that doesn't make the state go away. Then you see a kind of response to that in various policies about trying to reinscribe the abilities of states to, say, control their borders, or to regulate those companies, or to do something, to try to figure out where those companies, who it is that sort of interacts and critiques those companies. It's so I think that there's no linear story here where one emerges. You watch a movie, right? It's set in the 25th century, and it turns out the corporations have taken over the world, and there's no more states, or vice versa. That it's all the states and the corporations are doing. I think that's a science fiction. I think what you really are seeing is this constant relationship between the two, and even to think of them as both coherent. Like I said before, I mean, states are made up of lots of moving parts as well as companies, right? Agencies, people working inside of them, competition within itself as well as amongst one another, federal structures, these kinds of systems, all of which, federal structures, for example, also one could trace back to some form of corporate theory as well. So so I think my answer to your question, even though maybe it's a hedge of some sort, is to say that I do think that what you learn from looking at the history and looking today is not to get a prediction of a winner or a loser in the future, or how things are going to go. It's to allow you to see much more clearly what's going on in the present and the future, without bringing to the assumptions that say states do politics and companies do economics, and if you start from that premise, you don't really see actually what's happening, right?
Yeah, yeah, and of course, I think one of the key learnings I've had from, studying the colonial corporations of the time and their relationship with the crown or the state of that time, two things, right? One is that you can think of it from a functional standpoint. Like they start off from one function, these corporations, let's say trade to begin with, or finding new lands or new markets. But then slowly, as the stakes get higher, the geopolitics of it starts to become very, not dominant, but a lot more important. And that's where you see the East India Company, for example, going from a trading focused corporation into a governing and military and trading corporation, right? Whereas you mentioned the the fact that they start taxing when they get the Diwani, right? Rights in Mughal India, that's when their functions now have expanded, right? And I see that as a functional sort of spectrum that these corporations move on. Fast forward to today, you can see the parallels. Many of the tech companies of today might start with one function that they are focused on. For example, we can take a couple of names. Microsoft starts off as a software company that's building just desktop software, but today also happens to have one of the biggest cybersecurity teams in the world, right? And so the functional expansion of, I think, these corporations is an interesting parallel I see between, the period you've covered in your book and today. And the other piece is, I think the other learning that I see in that tug of war from earlier and today is the kind of institutional ways in which the state will often respond to regulate the tech firms of today or the trading firms of the era you talk about, right? You've spoken about how, at length, about how the almost tense relationship, even though it's often, they're often in bed with each other, also the members of parliament in England with the East India Company often as shareholders. But there's also a tense relationship between the philosophers of the time, the political theorists of the time, the economists of the time, and many of the other intellectual leaders of the time, right? So there's this tense relationship about how to regulate. And I found it very interesting, and I want you to talk more about that. What are some of the institutional innovations you saw in how the crown, in a way, starts to take back some of that power that the East India Company had subsumed within itself, and what lessons, if any, that might have for how countries or nation states are today thinking about regulating big tech firms, which seem to have sort of swept away some of the functions that were traditionally sovereign functions of the nation state.
Yeah, those are fantastic questions. On the first point, let me just say quickly, actually, going back to a question you asked me a while ago, like what are the social or larger implications of the corporate form? One thing corporations can do legally, and law changes over time, context changes, it changes from place to place. So this is just a generalization and thinking specifically about the kind of colonial environments I was talking about in the book. One thing corporations can do legally, structurally, joint stock enterprises, because of the nature of how they're financed, is they can evolve their purposes more easily, right? I mean, this was actually in the 19th century. A number of these colonial corporations that emerged, say for South Australia or in other places, a lot of when the British Colonial Office was sort of skeptical of these enterprises. One of the things that some of their lawyers said was, well, look, how do we know we let this thing happen? How do we know what it's going to do? It says it's interested in X, but now it's, in 10 years, it could be doing something
Doing
else. And
Y.
then can we control that? Right. And, and to go to your second point, maybe some of the things that emerge over time, to think about the state or regulatory regimes are legal doctrines or legislation or concepts like, say, ultra vires, or other concepts that corporations have charters, or they have incorporating documents that bind them to particular ways of doing things. But then, of course, that can always be, there are ways of coming back around that to sort of figure out.
And
you
what
know
about on the way that the empires of the time, or the crown at that time, thinks about regulating when it finally says, okay, now let's get back into control. There's the whole idea of governor general that comes in, and so things like that.
yeah
To talk to us about like how that evolves at that time, and what lessons, if any, that might have for today as nation states start to figure out, okay, how do we really think about even regulating these big tech firms that are often now bigger, more powerful than even nation states of most countries in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that especially as you get into the 19th century, you see it, but you saw it earlier as well, a great deal of discomfort with the uncontrollability of all of these different colonial enterprises outside the world. So the state, and so the state, and again, I really, I'll say this because the purposes of, eventually one has to sort of simplify or boil things down. But I want to say, when I talk about the state, you also are talking about, I said this before, not a single body acting in concert all the time,
In
but a lot of
unison. Correct.
competing. I mean, you think about it. All states have political differences. All states have have technical debates. In 19th century Britain, one of the functional sort of dynamics or debates in the inside of the state would have been like, say, the Foreign Office and the Colonial Office, or people inside the Colonial Office having different ideas about how things should get done, right?
Of course.
So that's important to realize. And some of them like the company model, some of them just really dislike the company
Don't.
model. But if we want to think about it on that big level, the states, the British state, for example, brings to bear ideas about, say, legal regulation, questions of how it might use charters and incorporation, articles of incorporation, and various legal mechanisms to hold the people who are running these companies accountable for their actions based upon British law. At the same time, those people argued back, who are these people running the state? Do they know how colonialism, this is a parliamentarian representing some little constituency in North England. What does he know about this? And so,
Okay.
so the
The tech
the
firm
debate and
today,
argument goes back
it's
and
a
forth.
tech firm.
Yeah.
It's a tech firm today. Sorry to interrupt. It's a tech firm saying today, you don't understand what artificial intelligence is. You don't understand,
Right.
20 years ago, you don't understand what the internet is. And so how are you better placed to regulate what we should be doing, right? So
And
clear
so
parallels of,
those debates, and I say, you mentioned before that I like to talk about genealogy, that is to say, how things evolve over time to become what they're, then rather than analogies. But the one exception to that rule, or what I say in the book, is that I said this before, what I really think the history lets you do is it lets you look at the questions, right, and see how they played out. And I couldn't agree with you more. You see very similar things going on today with companies, say some new regulatory model, say there's an investigation, right? The companies are confronted, and the companies are saying, well, we know our business and you don't, to the state. This is exactly what the East India Company, for example, or a number of these companies would say to the British state. The other thing they would do, and this is also, I think, a parallel with today, and one of the reasons I wrote this book as a historian, is underneath the arguments or the stories I tell in this book are one recurring theme from the 16th to the 20th centuries, which is when these companies were asked to justify themselves against those who would say either regulation, we can be regulated, or even more extremely, that colonization is the business of the state, which a lot of people came to argue at every point in this, including from Charles the First taking away the Virginia Company's charter in 1625, right?
yeah.
Um, is their argument was historical. They would say, but this is how we've always done it. This is how British colonialism, and the South Australia Company in the 19th century, its petition for a charter cites Humphrey Gilbert from the 16th century and the Virginia Company of the 17th century, saying this is the British model of how this is done, right? So history becomes an argument, and you see this. I think you see this in contemporary models as well, saying this, the government has not been involved in this. Don't get involved now. And so if you want to think about what states might take from the argument, it's not the only lesson you might take from this history, is to sort of understand how that the sleights of hand sometimes that are in those historical arguments, if that makes
And
sense,
of
right?
course, the other
It's
piece
not
that you
always the
talk
same.
about as the defense that these colonial corporations use when when they're now under threat of regulation and pullback is this idea of private property, right? So they pick on that legal point that is dear to many in the members of parliament that are looking to regulate, right? And they know that the members of parliament or these landed elites, the last thing they want is for the concept of private property to suddenly come under question. So I thought that that was also a very smart sleight of hand, you can call it, or a smart argument to begin with, that whatever private property we have now gained in lands in foreign territories is ours, cannot be the
Well,
states.
I think you're totally right about that, and thanks for bringing it up, because I would say I've already picked two prevailing arguments in addition to the historical one that you can see also mobilized today with, say, multinational corporations in relation to not just any state, but international law, for example. There are two arguments that are made by companies throughout this book that are worth paying attention to. One is the private property question, the question that not only do these companies claim private property in the territories and other resources they have outside of Britain, but they claim private property in the rights they have in the first place, charters, for example, or grants, right? But the other thing that's really critical, and again, one of these other like things that I knew going into the book but didn't really understand until I really spent years grappling with it, is how many times these companies make arguments against regulation based on the fact that they're not only British companies, but say the holder of a Mughal Divani, right? To say that these rights are vested in sometimes treaties, sometimes grants and concessions, oftentimes completely fabricated rights. This happens most notoriously in the late 19th century Africa, for example, that the idea that these companies' sovereignty and their rights are vested in some kind of set of agreements, sometimes conquest comes through different ways in different places, vested in indigenous forms of sovereignty that the British Crown has no authority over and therefore can't get rid of. Quick example: the British North Borneo Company, which becomes a model for a lot of these African colonial ventures in the late 19th century, and is actually, in a weird way, an offshoot by accident of the East India Company. Not accident, but it's not an East India Company project, but is related to long sort of history that wouldn't have happened in some ways without the East India Company's expansion in the region. The British, when the British North Borneo Company is requesting a charter from the British Crown, there are officials in the British government who argue we should give it to them because actually they're going to do it anyway, because they claim their sovereignty by the rights that they've sort of acquired in Borneo. And a charter is actually our only way of having any authority or say over what they do. So something that was an enabling process early on becomes a limiting process later, if that makes sense. And so that's part of the story. So I think those two things, and you see this constantly. This is the one that I was really taken with. I probably don't talk about it in the book as much as I could, but thankfully people like you give me opportunities to muse about it a little bit more. Which is think about the parallels with corporations that redomicile themselves or that diffuse their assets and their governance in ways so that they can say, well, I'm not an American company or I'm not a British, right? And that oh, you can't eliminate this company. The East India Company made this argument up until and through its removal from government in 1857, 1858. And well, you can't get rid of us. We have all of this. That would be to break all of these agreements we have in India and around Asia. It weaves, these corporations weave their way into the fabric of governance around the world, and very difficult to untangle. So one of the things in this book I kind of try to make the point is that we have this idea that the states authorize these companies and they can easily get rid of them. But part of the story of this book is just how difficult it is for other forms of
Absolutely. So we've spoken about the concept of venture colonialism. We've talked about the tug of war between the state and the private corporations. We've drawn some parallels with the big tech firms of today. But I want to talk to you now about the geopolitics of this one, right? And start talking about countries today, right? So you spoke of the British Empire. I think you mentioned somewhere in your book. You call it the incorporated empire as a result, right? I'm assuming because of these various corporations that are getting formed, and in a way, the British Empire becomes a amalgamation of these various colonial corporations spread around the world. How much of a parallel do you see between that and the US of today? Let me explain. So the US, now I'm coming from a technological standpoint. If you look at the tech geopolitics of today, there are three models that are spoken about. The Chinese, that is a state-led model, where the private and the public are more blurred than in any of the other two. Europeans who are saying, let me regulate the big tech firms like no other. I'm the regulatory superpower of the world. And then there's the US model that people talk about, which is let the corporations run free, largely, by and large, right? And in a way, the geopolitical power of the US today derives, at least from the outsider's perspective, derives largely from its large corporations as well today. As much as the US Army or the US government, it derives from the Googles and the Microsofts Amazons and the Teslas and the Starlinks of the world, right? You look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the US tech firms are active participants. It's a bit of a controversial question, but tell me, how much of a parallel do you see between the British incorporated empire, as you call it, and the US of today?
That's a good question. It's a hard one to answer. I think I can say a few things that probably contradict myself in the process, but
That's okay.
uh,
That's okay.
yeah, in the one sense, I see your point. I've been asked this before. Is this concept that we've heard before of corporations also as a form of soft power, right? Which is a hard and soft. I find these. I find those concepts very difficult to get my head around, but the idea that also it's a cultural imperialism that corporations help to produce as well, right? Movies, right? Uh, Consumable goods, these kinds of
Yeah,
things.
but
And I
I'm
think,
asking less about the
yeah,
soft power of these corporations, but really the hard power, right? The East India
yeah,
Company, of course, has soft power implications. It teaches the whole world English. It, brings British society and British institutions to be the aspirational way of being and all of that. But I'm actually right now talking primarily about the hard power that these corporations accumulate, bring, and then leverage at some point.
right. And that's what I was getting at, which is to say that I think in that sense you can see them working together or in tandem, having kind of relationships that forward one another's sort of interests, right? But I think in another way, though, there's a difference between the formal empire that the British Empire, in a sense, built and was administering, and the American Empire. And it's in this sense, which is when I say that when I talk about an incorporated empire of the British Empire, I mean literally absorbing the functions of these companies as territorial enterprises,
No,
right?
definitely, definitely. The U.S.
So
empire model, and I had a
right,
conversation with Daniel Immerwahr about this. That I don't know if you've come across his work, but
yeah, oh, I know,
he talks
yeah,
about the empire in hiding, right? I mean, or the
right.
pointillist empire, right? So clearly, the American empire model is very different from the British colonial
Right.
empire for very.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that's a difference, but I think the differences are instructive, right? It can help us. It doesn't mean that the U.S. is not an empire. It doesn't mean that concepts of colonialism and imperialism can't help us to understand what's going on in the U.S. But it's following this model, as I'm thinking about it as we speak, is following a different kind of trajectory in that I don't expect a future. I could be wrong. Right. I'm much better telling you what happened in the past than what's going to happen
I
next.
think
Right.
it must.
Um,
I
right.
think all of
But
us
but but
are.
I don't anticipate a future where the U.S. government absorbs and takes over the functions of an Amazon or a Google in the way that it took over the British government, and it says took over the functions of the East India Company in
No,
1858,
absolutely,
right? Right. So,
absolutely.
so, so
Right.
in that sense, it's a different trajectory, it's a different model. So there's the parallels can be seen in the kind of regulatory tug of war or ebb and flow we were talking about before, but in terms of the different models and forms of what that empire looked like. Now, I think at the margins you actually do see um, possibly some tension over uh, I don't think what I just said is 100% true, right? I think there are some sectors where government asserts itself and says, no, we're going to do that now. And private corporations don't do that now. Or you are starting to see things working themselves out. I think maybe possibly like say space exploration and for lack of a better word, possible colonization is one of those areas where if you ask some people, is one of those areas where there's an interesting future. And I've been doing a little work on this now. Moving forward, what are the implications of the work I do on thinking about these questions? Where that's an open question about which one is going to do it, especially when they're so entangled. When companies like SpaceX, for example, do so much provisioning of space agencies, for example, or something like that. Uh, when you see uh, uh, states also changing the relationship to these enterprises, so that's maybe one area where we might think that there's you can be looking and saying, well, here's a different trajectory. Maybe Amazon isn't the right model or isn't the right uh, the right thing to look at in terms of thinking about will it get absorbed by the state or will we see the same kind of incorporated empire? But maybe maybe that's a question that an area where one could see a privatized future or a public future or some combination of both, and we sort of have to watch how it develops, right?
Yeah, I mean, the space piece that you brought up. I mean, I wanted to talk about that also. I think there are clear parallels there, right? I mean, there are clear parallels that this is now a new territory. It's new lands in a way. It's a whole new ball game. So let the private sector take it. I mean, we don't care. Maybe once we have a clear sense of what is really at stake, the governments might say, much like the Crown said, now that we know how valuable the East India Company and its assets in India are, now let's come in. But really, when they come in, also, as you're rightly saying, it's still a little bit of a hybrid, right? I mean, there's the governance piece comes in on top, but the trading corporation and the nature of the East India Company's operations on the ground still say partly similar, at least to how they used to operate even before the Crown took over, right? And one can imagine a future today where, yes, maybe the actual space exploration is being undertaken by private firms, e-commerce is being done by private firms, cloud infrastructure is being built by private firms, cybersecurity capabilities are being built by private firms, but there is a sort of a governor general sitting on top.
Well, and or conversely, yeah. But the question is then, what direction? Who has power in those circumstances? And that's what I'd like to look at and sort of assess in a case by case basis. So, when you bring up the example of colonial India, one of the points I make in the book, maybe a little too quickly in retrospect, is that historians of British colonialism in India tend to really talk in general about two phases, right? There's the company's period, which ends in 1858, and then the crown period, which begins
Correct.
in after that. But just to your point, post 1858 colonial India is filled with companies, right? Of course it is, right? And those companies are doing everything from coal mining and tea plantations to banking and government finance. And so, and those companies are an artifact, not in all cases. I mean, a lot happens after 1858, but there's a lot of companies that were operating under these. Railways are a phenomenal example of this, right? Where thinking about them as purely private enterprises, I think, is a mistake, right? And this I'm talking about in the 19th century. And so you
Yes.
can see parallels today. I think who's doing the governing in any local or particular situation. Historians like to talk about informal versus formal empires. Empires where they're literally control, or informal empires where there's economic persuasion
Correct.
and pressure, right?
Yeah.
And the response I always have to that is that I don't really feel like informal empires often feel all that informal to the people who experience them, right? To the people who are subject to their power, right? It's a way
That's
historians or people, especially in the West, can kind of look and sort of remove and say, well, it's informal. It's a little less harsh. But the truth is that it really weaves its way into not just finance, but actually real on the ground control, even if that control is really just a small, relatively small to a nation state, for example, a small area, or it's what you might think was a corridor that a railway runs through. It's still, especially in the 19th century, a location of private governance. And in terms of the international uh, implications you're talking about, I think to get back to this question of incorporated empires, I think you also need to think a little bit about we talked about this briefly before. The capacity companies, not just tech. You think about oil or natural resource companies to almost follow foreign policies that diverge from the states as well. So
yes.
once they're in the international context, and this is not me, I studied, but there's great work. There's a book by journalist Steve Cole called Private Empire, which I like a great deal. Which it talks about ExxonMobil's capacity to run its own foreign policy around the world, right? And so there's yeah, sometimes it's in line with the government, sometimes it's not, and it's in that kind of gray area that I think you find the most interesting relationships. So in a way, you think about American empire, maybe the way to think about it, or any kind of empire, is not as, maybe this is how I would put it. Um, it's not. It's perhaps misleading to think about it. How does it get incorporated into the state or the United States? But it's actually a whole constellation of enterprises and interests that are leveraging that power in some way to produce this kind of imperial regime under a variety of what you might think of as a kind of plurality of jurisdictional forms. And you think about that whole big umbrella
Yeah, it's
as
more
what's
like the
making this
post
empire.
1857 British Empire in India than the pre 1857. So it's not one company. For example, you're saying it's the
Well,
plurality of organizations in a way that are benefiting still from the the empire existing and the empire being in control, formally or informally. But there's a plurality of corporations that are then benefiting.
I think the pre 1857 British India, British Empire in India also was not just the East India Company. But if you think about, say, the early railway companies I was just talking about before, there are also other corporations inside. And that's what I was talking about earlier when we first started off about how companies are not single entities. And then if you then telescope out and don't think of the British Empire as just the East India Company, but you think about the whole constellation of the hundreds of companies that I talk about in the book, actually early 19th, 18th, 17th century empire also looks a little like this, where the quote unquote British Empire, there's say people from Britain exerting claims over places around the world, is not just the British states. In fact, that's a very small part of it, but it's this whole constellation of different entities, which I think you can think of as at war with each other and in conflict with each other, but you can also think of as working together in some kind of in the book, and I don't know how people will make of the metaphor. I still myself debate it, but in the book, I think I talk about it as a kind of chaos theory, where there's all of
Yes,
these different things that are moving around, but you can see patterns in
that's right.
those
I
in
think
the movement.
uncoordinated, you said, but definitely not unintentional.
That is
That's
the
right.
thank you. That I did say that, didn't I? But that's what I mean, right? It's not working like a concert where it's all
Yeah,
being conducted centrally, but it is somehow making a unity,
yeah,
even though and
yeah, yeah,
that's maybe
yeah.
that's the right way. That's my long-winded answer to your
Yes,
excellent
sometimes
question.
we
Yeah.
write better than we. That's right. Um, no, I think that's absolutely right. I think that's a great characterization of the U.S. empire, and I think capturing the nuances of it also. And the other piece I want to pick on before we conclude is the way these corporations. I think what you just mentioned about ExxonMobil, the way these corporations will often sometimes align with, but sometimes not, with the global geopolitics of the time. You talk about, I think, the fact that the Anglo-French wars are a source of worry as well for the East India Company, right? I thought that parallel again was very interesting. That the East India Company does not want the Anglo-French wars and the implications of that to spill into their holdings in India. Of course, it ends up happening, right? As many of us in India know, I think, as you refer in your book, the Anglo-French rivalry spills into, especially into southern India, a lot, and the East India Company doesn't want it, but it's a receiver of the geopolitical implications of that broader geopolitical rivalry. And interestingly, the analogy that was happening in my head at the time is the current U.S. China geopolitical competition, and how that, whether the tech companies want it or not, is spilling into their sphere of work. It's impacting how much work they can or cannot do in China, for example, from the US standpoint, and vice versa from the Chinese tech firm standpoint, right? And it's spilling into it, and whether they want it or not, their foreign policies in a way have to align, or their foreign commercial policies in a way have to align, much like I think the East India Company eventually had to align with the broader geopolitical competition in play. What's your sense of that?
I think that's to some extent true. I would want to complicate it with two thoughts. One is that I think you also can tell a story about these companies pushing the limits of this kind of bipolar foreign policy and evading it and attempting at ways of challenging it as well. So this is a great example, right? So you see that those interests are different, and I don't know that it necessarily means that the interests of a large tech company or an oil company are going to inevitably snap in line with the foreign policies of states. I think there's a lot of capacities to get around them in a variety of ways, again by finding themselves in places, claiming relocating certain forms of business. Subsidiarization is a remarkable tool of getting around these sorts of things. And we're not doing it as this other company that's sort of related to us, right? Which these colonial companies did in a variety of ways all the time. The second thing I would say to this is that we inherited this Anglo-French story, which I do tell that story because it is an important one in the 18th century for sure. But this idea that the 18th century was, and other historians may disagree with me. You can have other people on to say I don't know what I'm talking about, but the story of the Anglo-French conflict, though it was one that was very relevant at the time in the 18th century, was also one that became, how do I put this? That we started to that was the story of Britain's rivalry with France is one that I think was told a lot in historiography in the second half of the 20th century, in which the world was built on a kind of bipolar political arrange, concept. There was an epic battle between the United States and the Soviet Union, for example. People thought about the world's always going to have two powers, and they're always going to be facing off against one another. But I think India is a wonderful, example of how, the story today about technology is not just about the United States and China, right? It's about a
Yeah.
lot of other players, both nation states and companies. So to reduce I think to reduce the world to a story about these two facing off is to follow one model. And I think to ignore that's a mistake. I think that it's absolutely there. But I think you think globally, and the moving pieces become a lot more complicated, especially when something like technology, we're figuring out where is it? Like, where are we right now having this conversation? It's very hard to answer that question, right? Um, this comes
Yeah.
up a lot. It comes up a lot in regulatory regimes. You probably know a lot more about this than I do. Of like, for example, if a tech company's servers are located in a particular place, does that give the jurisdictional authority of that place a right to regulate it, or is it taking place in are we in the United States or are we in India right now?
No, no,
Or are
absolutely,
we
absolutely. In fact, I mean, the title of my book is a play on exactly that idea, right? That
exactly, yeah.
the game, the great game between Britain and Russia at the time playing out in Central Asia was seen as a two-player game. But as I clearly argue even in my book, I think to your point that the great tech game, this competition and this dynamic is global. The game is global. Every country has a shot at it. Of course, at this moment of time, it seems that the US and China are the two major players. But much like Spain, Portugal were replaced by England and Netherlands, and then eventually other countries like France in the whole colonial great game. Similarly, I think in the great tech game, other players will emerge in my view. So I agree with you that I think maybe the bipolar frame of the world is not necessarily the only one we should be viewing the world with.
I just mean that the history that I talk about in the book helps us to see maybe the story as taking place in multiple dimensions at once, right? And
Yes.
then at any given time, I think that big political story of these two kind of nation states sort of facing off against each other is a is inescapably important, right? But I think that actually, if you only leave it at that story, then you might miss the dynamics of the complexities, of any number of questions about, including, so you mentioned French companies. Towards the end of the book in the 19th century, just as a matter of an example, I talk about sort of colonization in Southeast Africa in the 19th century, and try to make the point that, well, this is a Portuguese colony run by a Portuguese chartered company with a majority of British and French investors. Who's it? What nation is it that's doing this
Well,
colonization?
absolutely,
It
absolutely.
depends on the direction you look at it from, and especially with transnational investment, transnational governance, transnational operations and businesses, the diffusion of production with technology, the diffusion of, you talk about something like
Yeah,
blockchain. It's
absolutely.
really hard to put your finger on it, right? So
No,
it is
absolutely,
global. I think that's the
absolutely.
answer. Yeah,
Yeah, and
yeah.
that's right. I think, and that's the complexity you have to look at it with. I completely agree. But this has been absolutely fascinating, Philip. The thing that we do towards the end of every podcast episode is I ask you two questions, simple ones, for a change. One, which book would you recommend to, of course, other than your own and other than mine, for listeners of our podcast to listen to if they're interested in, the kind of themes we've been talking about? One. And second, recommendation of a guest that you think we would also enjoy having um, sometime down the line on our podcast.
Oh, that's well. This is tough. I'm going to regret I'm going to think of five more answers to your question as soon as we hang up. But I mentioned the one that comes to mind because I mentioned it already is that
Private Empire.
is Private Empire by Steve Cole. It's not it's not that recent of a book, but I think it's for people thinking about this, especially when it comes to if you want to think about I find the book very thought provoking. It's very inspiring. Some of the stuff I've been writing. And I think that one of the things it helps you to think about is how this works with material products like natural resources, as well as the sort of more diffuse questions that come up with technology, right? In terms of jurisdictional questions. So I think that's always been a really powerful question. Yeah, and of course, in addition to our two books, those definitely we should recommend.
And what about
But
the guest?
that's what comes to mind. A guest that comes to mind. That's a really good question. I think I don't know that he's interested in these things, but Steve Cole, who wrote that book, I think it would be a very interesting person to have to think about having. I think that someone like I know that someone like William Dalrymple, who we were talking about before, who's talked about this in his recent book, which I'm sure a lot of your listeners would know, with particular reference to the East India Company as a very interesting possibility. I think there's so many. I'm I'm actually sneakily trying to look over my bookshelf, just try to pick one of the many
Please
people,
do.
because one of the many, when you write a book over 400 years, it just felt like it took 400 years, but I mean, you're covering the study of 400 years. Um, it's a book where I owe so much debt to
Yeah.
so much good scholarship and so much work, that there's so many different kinds of people. So I'm going to leave it at those two, who
Yeah.
I think would be excellent. I'm sure I will think of others, and then you'll have to splice in my recommendations.
No,
Yeah,
perfect. Now these are both
yeah.
great recommendations, a great recommendation on the book as well. And
Yeah.
thank you so much for taking the time. It's been a pleasure. There's still another 10 questions I could have asked, but I'm glad that we got the chance to do this, and we'll hopefully be in touch. And if your future books or your future research brings you to India, please do let me know. We'd love to get together a group of folks here who are interested in empires and geopolitics and tech firms and nation states and all the things that I think you breathe day in day out.
I absolutely, and thank you so much for the opportunity. And I will take you up on that if you're over here. Same goes. I really am thrilled with the opportunity, and I speak to a lot of historians very interested in colonialism, but to think about the implications for this for the world today and the future, as much as I get nervous about predicting the future, I really appreciate the opportunity to speculate
Yeah, and I
wildly
think it's very
about it.
important also that we continue to draw distinctions between. There's a lot of, I mean, and this is a piece we didn't get too much, but hopefully in a future in-person conversation, there's a whole talk of digital colonialism, data colonialism, terms like these that get thrown around, and I find that sometimes they're thrown around a bit too loosely, but they're worth sort of studying and then unpacking. I think in the kind of complexity that you often bring to your answers. But that's for a future conversation, hopefully in person. And thank you again so much for taking the time to be with us today.
I will look forward to that. Thank you so much.